In the depths of a rugged wilderness, an injured wolf, desperate and bleeding, approached a solitary man with an unspoken plea for help. With every pained whimper, the wolf's eyes pleaded for rescue, challenging the man's hardened resolve. Deep in the heart of the wild, where survival is a daily struggle and every creature battles against the odds, an injured wolf appeared on the path of a lone traveler. The wolf, its fur matted and blood staining its side, moved with a painful determination, its eyes filled with a mix of agony and an unyielding hope. For years, it had roamed the forest alone, forced to fend for itself after a brutal encounter that left it scarred, both physically and emotionally. In that moment, as the wolf limped towards him, it didn't attack or flee. Instead, it came close and sat down, head bowed as if begging silently for help. The man, a solitary hiker named Jack, had long been accustomed to the harsh realities of the wilderness. Hardened by years of traversing remote trails and witnessing nature's relentless cruelty, he was initially taken aback by the sight of the wounded creature. However, there was something in the wolf's eyes, an unmistakable vulnerability that struck a deep chord within him. Compelled by an instinct he couldn't ignore, Jack slowly approached, mindful not to startle the fragile animal. In that delicate, suspended moment, as Jack knelt beside the injured wolf, the air seemed to hold its breath. What had driven this noble creature to such despair? And what mysterious force had left it so grievously wounded? Over the following hours, as Jack carefully tended to the wolf's injuries with the few supplies he carried, an unexpected transformation began to take shape. The wolf, once consumed by pain and distrust, started to relax under his gentle care. Its pained whimpers gradually turned into soft, rhythmic sighs, a silent acknowledgement of relief. Yet, just as the first signs of hope appeared, events took an unforeseen turn that would challenge everything Jack thought he knew about the wild. What happened next would defy his expectations and leave him, and everyone who hears this story, completely shocked. Jack's solitary trek along a rugged trail had always been a meditation on the raw beauty and indifferent brutality of nature. On that fateful day, as the late afternoon sun cast long, dappled shadows across the forest floor, he was deep in thought about the endless cycle of survival when he heard a faint, irregular sound, a soft whimper that didn't quite belong to the usual chorus of the wilderness. Curious and cautious, he followed the sound until he came upon a sight that would forever alter his journey. There, barely hidden by a curtain of overgrown ferns, lay a wolf. But this was no majestic creature roaming freely. It was injured, its once sleek coat now marred by patches of matted fur and blood. The wolf's side was visibly wounded, a deep gash that pulsed with each labored breath. Its eyes, usually wild and wary, held a look of profound pain mixed with an almost desperate plea. For a long moment, Jack stood frozen, caught between his instinct for self-preservation and an overwhelming sense of empathy that surged through him. In that silent exchange, as if the wounded animal was speaking a language beyond words, Jack sensed that this was a call for help, a plea that resonated with something deep within his own soul. Driven by a compassion he had long kept at bay, Jack slowly approached the wolf, taking care not to startle it further. His heart pounded, but his movements were deliberate and gentle. He knelt on the soft, leaf-strewn ground and spoke in a soothing, low tone. "It's all right," he murmured. "I'm here to help." With steady hands, he retrieved the small first aid kit he always carried on his hikes, a humble collection of bandages, antiseptic wipes, and a few ointments meant for minor scrapes. As he began to examine the wolf's wound, every detail of its suffering was etched into his memory. The slow, rhythmic rise and fall of its chest, the quivering of its muzzle, and the way its eyes, though clouded with pain, seemed to glimmer with hope when he came closer. Despite his own reservations about getting too close to a wild animal, Jack's innate kindness took over. He carefully cleaned the wound with antiseptic wipes, his hands trembling slightly as he worked. The wolf whimpered softly, and for a moment, Jack felt as though time had slowed, each second stretching into an eternity filled with shared vulnerability. In that fragile moment, the barrier between man and wild began to erode. The injured wolf, whom Jack would later come to call Spirit for the resilient glimmer in its eyes, seemed to understand that the stranger before it was not a threat, but a savior. As Jack continued to tend to Spirit's injury, he reflected on the irony of the encounter. Here was a creature, built by nature to be fierce and self-reliant, reduced to a state of helplessness by the cruelty of fate. The sight of Spirit's suffering awakened memories of Jack's own struggles, moments of vulnerability during long, solitary hikes, times when the harshness of nature had reminded him that even the strongest souls could be broken. Yet, in offering his care to the wounded wolf, Jack felt a stirring of hope, a quiet belief that compassion could mend even the deepest wounds. Throughout that day and the days that followed, Spirit's presence became a constant companion on Jack's journey. The wolf, once cautious and fearful, began to show small signs of trust. Although still wary, Spirit would occasionally approach Jack, allowing him a glimpse of its tender, pained eyes, a silent thank you, perhaps, for the care that had begun to ease its suffering. Jack documented every detail in his worn leather journal, noting not only the physical progress of the wound's healing, but also the subtle changes in the wolf's behavior, a slow but sure transition from terror to tentative trust. In the quiet moments of twilight, as the forest settled into a gentle hush, Jack would sit by a crackling campfire, the memory of Spirit's plaintive gaze burning in his mind. He wondered what stories the wolf carried within its wounded soul, and whether this unexpected encounter was a chance for both of them to begin anew. For Jack, who had long believed that the wilderness was an indifferent realm where survival was the only rule, this act of kindness sparked an internal revolution. It challenged him to redefine his relationship with nature, not as a harsh adversary to be conquered, but as a living, breathing world in which every creature, no matter how battered, deserved compassion. Thus, as the days stretched into a quiet rhythm of healing and discovery, Jack realized that his encounter with Spirit was more than a mere act of charity. It was a transformative moment that blurred the lines between the wild and the human heart, inviting him to embrace a deeper, more empathetic understanding of life itself. Just as Jack's quiet acts of compassion were beginning to bridge the gap between his hardened solitude and the wounded spirit of the wolf he now called Spirit, a startling discovery upended everything he had assumed about the animal's past. One overcast afternoon, while retracing his steps along a familiar trail near a moss-covered rock formation, Jack noticed something unusual embedded in the soft earth. There, partially concealed beneath fallen leaves and tangled underbrush, lay a small weathered object, a fragment of a broken necklace, its delicate chain tarnished by time. The pendant, though cracked and worn, bore an intricate engraving of a wild, soaring eagle, a symbol Jack recognized from an old family heirloom he'd seen in his childhood. Curious and heart-pounding with a mix of apprehension and intrigue, Jack gently retrieved the pendant. As he cleaned off the grime, he realized that the eagle was a symbol deeply rooted in local lore, a sign believed to represent freedom, protection, and, in some traditions, a message from the spirit world. The discovery of this artifact so close to where Spirit had been found was too coincidental to ignore. It hinted at a hidden narrative behind the wolf's injuries, one that went far beyond the brutal realities of the wild. Jack's mind raced with possibilities. Had Spirit's injury been caused not by a random encounter with a predator, but by deliberate human interference? The meticulous way the wound had been inflicted, combined with the pendant's appearance, led him to suspect that someone might have purposefully attacked the wolf. Was it the work of poachers? Or perhaps a cruel individual intent on sending a message? The thought sent a chill through him, a realization that the wilderness, already unforgiving on its own, could harbor human cruelty even deeper and more insidious than he had ever imagined. Determined to uncover the truth, Jack decided to venture back to the area where he'd found the pendant. With Spirit following cautiously at his side, he retraced his steps to the mossy clearing near the ancient rock formation. There, hidden among clusters of ferns and damp leaves, he discovered fresh signs of disturbance. Small, deliberate scratches on the bark of a nearby tree and a scattering of unusual, deep claw marks on the soft soil. The marks were not those typically made by a wild animal in a scuffle. They were too deliberate, too methodical. They appeared as if someone had used a sharp tool, perhaps in an attempt to intimidate or even capture the creature. With these new clues in hand, Jack's heart sank. The narrative that had unfolded over the past few days, of a wounded wolf slowly learning to trust a compassionate stranger, had now taken on a darker hue. It seemed that Spirit's past was not solely a story of natural hardship, but might be entangled with a deliberate act of cruelty committed by humans. The notion was both heartbreaking and enraging. For a creature that had already endured so much, to be targeted further by human malice was a truth too bitter to fathom. Later that evening, as the forest grew quiet and the sky hinted at the approach of twilight, Jack sat by a small campfire near the clearing, turning the pendant over in his hands. The flames danced across its surface, highlighting the intricate eagle design, a symbol of hope, yet now marred by the context of its discovery. In that reflective silence, he made a decision. He would not let the cruelty that had wounded Spirit go unanswered. The discovery of the pendant, the deliberate claw marks, and the peculiar scratches on the tree formed a damning trail that he was determined to follow. The next morning, with a renewed sense of purpose, Jack contacted local authorities and animal welfare groups. He shared his findings, the pendant, the marks on the tree, and his observations of Spirit's injury, and urged them to investigate the possibility of human interference. While some officials were initially skeptical, the tangible evidence began to shift opinions. A local wildlife investigator, intrigued by the precise nature of the marks, agreed to accompany Jack back to the clearing for a more thorough examination. Together, they documented every detail, from the fresh claw marks in the soft earth to the position where the pendant had been found. As the investigation deepened, whispers began to circulate in the local community about a shadowy figure known to lurk in the fringes of the forest, a figure rumored to be involved in illegal activities, including the capture and exploitation of wildlife. Though these were mere whispers at first, the accumulating evidence gave credence to these claims. The revelation that Spirit's injury might have been inflicted as part of a broader pattern of human cruelty transformed Jack's mission from one of compassionate rescue into a quest for justice. In that moment, Jack realized that his journey with Spirit had become much more than an act of kindness. It had evolved into a crusade against human exploitation of the vulnerable. The transformation in the wounded wolf was a mirror, reflecting not just the brutality of nature, but the cruelty that some humans were capable of inflicting upon it. Determined and resolute, Jack vowed to follow the trail of evidence wherever it might lead, even if it meant confronting the dark underbelly of human greed and cruelty. This twist, revealing that Spirit's injury might be a deliberate act of human malice, cast a new light on his entire journey. It was no longer just a tale of survival and transformation. It was a call to action, a demand for accountability in a world that often turns a blind eye to the suffering of the innocent. Following the revelation that Spirit's injury might have been caused by deliberate human cruelty, the emotional landscape around Jack's discovery shifted dramatically. No longer was his story solely about a wounded wolf struggling for survival in the indifferent wilderness. It had become a narrative of profound injustice that demanded a response from every individual touched by it. At first, Jack's immediate circle of fellow hikers and local residents reacted with a mix of shock, sympathy, and indignation. When Jack recounted his discovery of the pendant, the deliberate claw marks, and the mysterious scratches on the tree, those who had known him as a quiet, independent traveler were stunned into action. In the local diner, where whispers of the incident soon turned into loud discussions, one patron exclaimed, "This isn't just nature's cruelty, it's human cruelty at its worst." The community's outrage grew as more details emerged, and it became clear that a wealthy man's callous act had left a wounded creature to suffer in silence. Jack's own emotional journey was equally turbulent. Having always prided himself on his self-reliance and his ability to navigate the hardships of the wild, he found himself grappling with the stark contrast between nature's indifference and human malice. The realization that someone had deliberately inflicted such harm on Spirit shook him to his core. Late at night, while camped near the clearing where he'd found the pendant, Jack's eyes filled with tears as he reflected on the cruelty he had uncovered. He questioned the very fabric of human decency and wondered how a man could justify such a heartless act. This internal conflict forced Jack to confront his long-held beliefs about the world, stirring a deep desire not only to help Spirit recover, but also to seek justice against the hidden perpetrator. Local animal welfare advocates were quick to seize upon Jack's findings. At a community meeting organized by a local rescue group, impassioned speakers denounced the millionaire's cruelty, and calls for a thorough investigation grew louder. "We can't let this go unanswered," one activist declared, her voice echoing through the packed room. "Every animal deserves protection from human greed." Their passionate words ignited a spark of hope among those who believed that the case of Spirit was emblematic of a broader problem, a systemic neglect of the vulnerable by those with power. Yet, not all reactions were unanimous. A few pragmatic voices in the community urged caution, arguing that while the evidence was disturbing, it was important not to jump to conclusions without thorough investigation. "We need solid proof before we start casting blame," one local official remarked during a heated discussion. These skeptics were concerned that emotions might override facts, potentially leading to hasty decisions that could have unintended consequences. Despite their reservations, even these cautious voices began to shift as more tangible evidence emerged through collaborative efforts between Jack, local wildlife investigators, and the rescue organization. Within the local media, the story of Spirit began to dominate headlines. Journalists, initially drawn by the sensational aspect of a wounded wolf's plea for help, soon delved deeper into the investigation. Interviews with former employees of the millionaire and leaked documents revealed a disturbing pattern of neglect and exploitation, further polarizing public opinion. Editorials questioned the moral responsibility of the wealthy and the ethical implications of a society that allowed such cruelty to flourish. The media coverage turned the story into a rallying cry for change, galvanizing public sentiment and forcing local authorities to take notice. For Jackie, these developments meant that his personal journey was now part of a larger movement. His initial act of compassionate rescue had evolved into a mission to expose and rectify human cruelty in the natural world. However, this transformation was not without its personal costs. Jack struggled with the weight of responsibility, feeling that every step he took toward uncovering the truth was also a step into a murky moral territory. His once solitary excursions now carried the burden of representing not just his own integrity, but also the collective hope for justice from a community scarred by exploitation. In private, Jack confided in a close friend about his inner turmoil. "I always thought I was prepared for the wild," he admitted, his voice low and wavering. "But nothing could have prepared me for the realization that humans can be just as cruel and just as capable of change as nature itself." These honest conversations became a vital part of his healing process, allowing him to reconcile the shock of the revelation with his emerging commitment to fight for the vulnerable. As the days turned into weeks, the case of Spirit spurred a wave of community initiatives. Local animal shelters ramped up efforts to care for abandoned animals, and town meetings became platforms for discussing animal welfare policies and the ethical responsibilities of the privileged. Through it all, Spirit's gradual recovery from labored, pained whimpers to moments of quiet trust served as a symbol of hope and resilience. Every cautious step he took was a testament to the power of compassion, a silent reminder that even in a world marred by cruelty, healing was possible. In this crucible of conflicting emotions and divided opinions, Jack realized that his path forward required him not only to seek justice for Spirit, but also to serve as a bridge between raw, human vulnerability and the cold, indifferent laws of nature. He resolved to continue his investigation, to document every detail, and to ensure that the truth behind Spirit's suffering would not be buried beneath layers of indifference. The transformation of a once terrified wolf and the community's response to it underscored a timeless truth, that acts of kindness, no matter how small, have the power to spark profound change. As the investigation into Spirit's mysterious injury deepened, Jack began to notice that his encounter with the wounded wolf was only one piece of a much larger puzzle. What had initially appeared as a singular, tragic event was gradually revealing layers of complexity that intertwined with local history, community tensions, and even hidden human agendas. One morning, while Jack was retracing his steps near the area where he had found the torn pendant and the deliberate claw marks, he stumbled upon an unusual set of footprints leading off the main trail. Unlike the haphazard tracks of a wild animal in distress, these prints were precise and methodical, suggesting the deliberate intervention of another being. Intrigued, Jack photographed the tracks and noted their direction, which led him toward an overgrown path that veered off into a dense thicket. Was it possible that Spirit's injury was not merely a consequence of a random encounter, but part of a premeditated act carried out by someone or something with a hidden motive? Around the same time, local whispers began to spread about a shadowy figure seen near the forest's edge on several occasions. Neighbors who often roamed the outskirts of town reported glimpsing a person in dark clothing, moving stealthily between the trees. Some claimed that this mysterious figure had been observed near spots where unusual animal behavior was noted. The rumor quickly fueled speculation. Could this individual be connected to the deliberate marks Jack had found, or even to the same force that had wounded Spirit? The community, already stirred by the dramatic events surrounding the injured wolf, now buzzed with theories that hinted at human involvement in an otherwise natural tragedy. Simultaneously, Jack received an unexpected email from an anonymous sender. The message was brief but chilling. Not all wounds are caused by nature. Look deeper into the darkness where secrets hide. Attached to the email was a blurred image of what appeared to be a small, dilapidated structure deep within the forest, a building that local law claimed had once served as a hidden refuge for those involved in illicit activities. The cryptic note suggested that the cruelty inflicted upon Spirit might be part of a broader pattern of human exploitation of the wild, where profit and power masked sinister actions. Meanwhile, local animal welfare volunteers began reporting discrepancies in other cases of abandoned or injured wildlife. A volunteer named Sarah, who had long worked at the regional shelter, mentioned that she had come across a series of reports about animals with similar, oddly precise injuries. Although these cases were few and far between, they painted a disturbing picture, a pattern that hinted at deliberate harm rather than mere misfortune. This emerging pattern added urgency to Jack's quest, urging him to connect his personal encounter with the broader trends documented by those on the front lines of animal rescue. Adding to the mounting intrigue, a local journalist, Mark, known for his investigative pieces on environmental and social issues, reached out to Jack. Mark had been tracking the story of injured wildlife in the region and believed that there was a link between these incidents and the activities of a notorious local businessman rumored to have a history of unethical practices. In a quiet conversation at a small cafe, Mark shared details from confidential sources who hinted that the businessman's enterprises might have ties to illegal poaching and the exploitation of local resources, including wildlife. Although nothing had been definitively proven yet, these revelations cast a dark shadow over the millionaire's public image and provided a potential connection to the deliberate nature of Spirit's injuries. In addition, the local community itself became a theater of conflicting voices. At town hall meetings and community gatherings, some residents argued passionately that the wilderness was unforgiving by nature, and that the injuries Spirit sustained were simply part of the harsh reality of life in the wild. Animals must fend for themselves, one skeptical resident asserted, and sometimes the struggle is just the way of the world. In contrast, a growing number of citizens, stirred by Jack's story and the emerging evidence of human intervention, demanded accountability. They insisted that if a person was responsible for intentionally harming a creature as noble as a wolf, then the community had a moral duty to uncover the truth and bring the culprit to justice. This clash of perspectives created a fertile ground for further investigation, and Jack found himself increasingly isolated in his determination to dig deeper. His nights became a montage of restless walks through the forest, photographing every unusual mark, every set of precise claw imprints, and every shadow that might conceal the elusive figure rumored to be lurking nearby. His journal filled with sketches and hurried notes, each entry capturing the mounting tension between natural adaptation and human cruelty. Yet amid these challenges, there were moments of unexpected solidarity. Local wildlife experts and seasoned hikers began to share their own stories, tales of mysterious encounters and inexplicable phenomena that had, in their own way, challenged the cold logic of modern life. One elderly man recounted a memory of a time when a stray wolf had appeared during a period of community hardship, leading to a small, miraculous recovery that was attributed to a long-forgotten ritual of kindness. These shared narratives, though varying in detail, lent weight to the idea that Spirit's ordeal might be part of a much larger, almost ritualistic phenomenon, a convergence of human malice and nature's resilient response. Thus, as Jack pieced together these disparate threads, a series of precise footprints, anonymous warnings, insider reports on unethical practices, and a chorus of community voices both skeptical and hopeful, the story of Spirit transformed into a multifaceted mystery. It was no longer just about a wounded animal begging for help. It was a symbol of a deeper, more insidious pattern of exploitation that threatened the delicate balance of the wild. Every new subplot raised fresh questions. Who was behind the deliberate marks? Was there a larger network involved in the exploitation of wildlife? And could these revelations force a reckoning that would reshape the community's approach to conservation and justice? In the face of these mounting challenges and revelations, Jack's resolve grew stronger. He realized that his mission was no longer simply to help an injured wolf. It had become a quest for truth and accountability, a fight against cruelty that had seeped into the heart of both nature and human society. With each step he took deeper into the forest, every piece of evidence he collected reinforced the notion that sometimes the most profound injustices hide in the shadows. As the layers of mystery deepened around Spirit's deliberate injuries and the clues pointing to human involvement, Jack found himself entangled in a web of conflicting emotions and challenging responsibilities. Every new piece of evidence, the precise footprints, the blurred images, and the anonymous messages, had not only fueled his determination to uncover the truth, but also stirred internal turmoil that questioned the very nature of his role as a rescuer in the wild. Late at night, as Jack pored over his photographs and scribbled notes by the dim light of his campfire, he was forced to confront the stark reality of what he had witnessed. The deliberate claw marks, too uniform to be a random act of nature, suggested a cold, calculated cruelty. It was a possibility that weighed heavily on him, a realization that the wilderness, already indifferent and often brutal, might harbor an even darker facet of human malice. In these solitary hours, his mind raced with questions. Who could target a noble creature like Spirit? What motives lurked behind such targeted cruelty? And how many others had suffered in silence under similar circumstances? These internal conflicts were mirrored by the external pressures from the community. Local animal welfare groups, emboldened by Jack's findings, began to mobilize, organizing small vigils and protests. Flyers appeared around town with messages demanding accountability and justice for Spirit and all vulnerable wildlife. At one community meeting, passionate voices clashed. One activist argued, "If a person can intentionally wound a creature as magnificent as a wolf, then our community must stand up and demand answers." In contrast, more pragmatic residents cautioned that while emotional responses were understandable, solid evidence was required before taking drastic measures. This tension between raw emotion and rationality added yet another layer of complexity to the unfolding drama. Jack's personal journey became increasingly isolating as he dedicated himself to tracing every clue. His once solitary hikes now took on a new urgency, and each step in the forest was a careful negotiation between hope and despair. On several occasions, he found himself retracing the mysterious footprints and pausing at spots where the anonymous messages had hinted at hidden signs. In one particularly haunting moment, while walking along a narrow, dew-soaked trail, Jack encountered a patch of disturbed earth where fresh claw marks, distinctly different from those made by a wild animal, were etched into the soil. The sight made his heart race, and he couldn't help but feel that he was stepping into a realm where human cruelty intersected with nature's raw brutality. These discoveries forced Jack to confront uncomfortable truths about the human cost of exploitation. He recalled whispered stories from local residents about illegal poaching rings and unscrupulous businessmen who exploited the wilderness for profit. One evening, while sitting in a modest roadside diner, he overheard a conversation among older locals discussing a notorious figure rumored to be behind a series of animal abuses. Although the details were vague, the implications were chilling. Spirit's injury might have been part of a larger systematic effort to silence and exploit the vulnerable. This realization filled Jack with a profound sense of duty, not only to help Spirit, but also to ensure that such cruelty was exposed and ended. At the same time, Jack's inner turmoil deepened as he grappled with the weight of these revelations. He had always believed that the wild was an arena where nature's laws reigned supreme, indifferent to human morality. Yet now, he was witnessing the scars left not by nature, but by human hands, a betrayal that cut deep into the very heart of the wilderness. Each new piece of evidence felt like a personal indictment, a call to action that transcended his role as a simple rescuer. He found himself questioning the limits of his compassion and the extent to which he was willing to risk his own safety and peace of mind in order to bring the truth to light. Adding to his emotional burden was the evolving relationship with Spirit. The wounded wolf, whose survival had once seemed a miraculous fluke, now stood as a symbol of both vulnerability and resilience. On quieter days, when Spirit would rest near Jack's side after a long day's trek, Jack could almost read the animal's thoughts in its gentle, trusting eyes, a silent plea for justice, for recognition of the cruelty it had endured. In those moments, Jack's resolve hardened. He knew that his mission had grown beyond mere survival. It had become a quest for accountability and healing, not only for Spirit, but for all those harmed by human greed. In the solitude of his camp, with the forest whispering its ancient secrets, Jack began to document his emotional journey alongside his physical investigation. His journal entries grew raw and introspective, capturing the pain, the hope, and the quiet determination that fueled him each day. He wrote about the recurring conflict between the need for scientific evidence and the undeniable emotional impact of what he had witnessed. He questioned whether the human cost of neglect could ever be measured by facts alone, or if it was, in essence, a matter of the heart. Thus, in the interplay between nature's indifferent majesty and the cruelty of human actions, Jack found himself at a crossroads, a point where the path forward was shrouded in both mystery and moral imperative. Each new clue, each heated conversation, and every agonizing moment spent in the darkened forest underscored the urgency of his mission. He resolved that he would not let fear or indifference silence the truth. Instead, he would forge ahead, determined to expose the hidden network of exploitation and bring justice to Spirit and others like him. As the investigation into Spirit's mysterious injury and the dark hints of human interference deepened, Jack felt the tension reach a breaking point. The evidence he had painstakingly gathered, the deliberate claw marks, the torn pendant, and the precise footprints, now painted a chilling picture of cruelty that extended far beyond a single act of neglect. It was time for final confrontations, for decisions that would not only determine Spirit's fate, but also expose the hidden network of exploitation behind his suffering. One overcast morning, with the forest shrouded in a persistent mist, Jack received a call from a local wildlife investigator who had been reviewing his documentation. The investigator, a gruff but fair man named Peter, confirmed that the injury on Spirit's side was too methodical to be accidental. "I've seen wild animals get hurt in fights or accidents," Peter explained in a low, serious tone. "But these marks were made with purpose. Someone was targeting him." Peter's words hit Jack like a sledgehammer. The notion that human cruelty might have deliberately wounded Spirit filled him with both fury and sorrow. He knew that this was more than just a personal rescue. It was a fight against a system that allowed such exploitation to thrive. Later that day, Jack convened an urgent meeting with a small group of trusted locals, members of the wildlife rescue organization, sympathetic community activists, and even a few former employees who had hinted at darker practices by the millionaire responsible for Spirit's abandonment. In a cramped makeshift conference room in a community center on the outskirts of town, the air was thick with a mix of determination and raw emotion. Photographs, maps, and handwritten notes were spread out on a battered wooden table. Every piece of evidence pointed toward a disturbing pattern of neglect and cruelty, a pattern that suggested Spirit's suffering was not an isolated event, but part of a broader network of abuse. Jack stood at the head of the table, his eyes burning with a fierce resolve as he addressed the group. "Spirit's injury isn't just a random misfortune," he began, his voice steady yet laced with anger. "It's a deliberate act. The marks on his side, the way he was left to bleed, these aren't accidents. They're messages, and it's our duty to follow them." His words resonated deeply with the assembled group. There were murmurs of agreement, mixed with expressions of concern about the risks of confronting powerful figures in the community. Among the attendees was a young wildlife advocate named Lena, who had lost a beloved pet to similar cruelty. Tears welled in her eyes as she recounted the pain of her loss, vowing to ensure that no other creature would suffer the same fate. "We can't let this go," Lena insisted. "If a man with all his resources can treat an animal like this, then he can treat anyone as disposable. We must stand up for those who can't speak for themselves." As the meeting progressed, a former employee of the millionaire, speaking on condition of anonymity, presented damning evidence, a series of internal memos and photographs that revealed a history of systematic animal neglect and exploitation. The document showed that the millionaire had a reputation for discarding animals once they no longer served his image, a stark contradiction to his public persona of philanthropy. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. The cruelty behind Spirit's injury was not a one-time lapse. It was emblematic of a much larger, more insidious practice. With the damning evidence laid bare, the group debated the next course of action. Some called for immediate legal action, while others argued for a comprehensive investigation that would expose the full scope of the abuse. Jack, feeling the weight of responsibility, proposed a combined approach. They would gather further evidence, secure witness testimonies, and collaborate with local authorities who were sympathetic to their cause. "We need to be meticulous," Jack stated firmly. "Our goal is not only to bring the culprit to justice, but to ensure that this network of cruelty is dismantled once and for all." The discussion soon turned to strategy. The group decided that a coordinated effort was essential. Lena volunteered to help with community outreach, urging anyone with information to come forward. A small task force was formed, combining the expertise of wildlife rescuers, investigative reporters, and former insiders. Jack was to lead the field investigation, while Peter and other experts would analyze the physical evidence. Their plan was ambitious but necessary, a multi-pronged approach to confront the deep-seated malice that had wounded Spirit. In a moment of raw determination, Jack addressed the group once more. "We cannot allow the cruelty that harmed Spirit to continue in silence," he declared. "Each new piece of evidence is a step toward healing for not only him, but for every living being neglected by those with power. It's time we stood together and let our voices be heard." His passionate words galvanized the group, and even the skeptics found themselves nodding in agreement, moved by the palpable urgency of his mission. That night, as the task force prepared to launch their investigation, Jack reflected on the path that had brought him to this point. His journey had begun with a solitary act of compassion, a single moment when he chose to help an injured animal. Now that moment had unfolded into a battle against systemic cruelty, a battle that demanded courage, unity, and an unyielding commitment to justice. In the cool darkness of the forest, with the sound of Spirit's soft whimpers echoing in his ears and the support of a determined community behind him, Jack felt a surge of resolve. The confrontation ahead would not be easy, but it was a necessary step toward restoring dignity and balance to a world too often marred by exploitation. With a final nod to his team, he stepped forward, ready to face the dark forces behind the cruelty and to shine a light on the hidden truths that had long been buried in the shadows. In the weeks following the shocking discovery of the deliberate marks and the mysterious pendant, Jack's investigation into Spirit's injury began to reveal additional layers of complexity that connected his personal journey with broader community dynamics. What started as a solitary act of compassion was rapidly evolving into a tapestry of intertwined subplots, drawing in local activists, investigative journalists, and wildlife experts, all of whom were beginning to share a common goal: to expose the hidden cruelty that had scarred the wilderness. One early breakthrough came when Jack received a call from a retired park ranger, Mr. Thompson, who had spent decades patrolling these very woods. Mr. Thompson's voice, weathered by years in the field, trembled as he recounted similar incidents he had witnessed in the past, cases where animals bore wounds that didn't match the patterns of natural encounters. "I remember a time when a wolf, much like Spirit, showed signs of being deliberately injured," Mr. Thompson recalled. "There were whispers among us rangers that someone was using these animals as pawns in a cruel game, a way to send a message." His account added a historical dimension to Jack's evidence, hinting that the cruelty Spirit had endured might be part of a recurring, sinister pattern that had plagued the forest for years. Simultaneously, local animal welfare advocates began to take an active interest in the case. Sarah, a dedicated volunteer at the Regional Wildlife Rescue Center, reached out to Jack with information gathered from multiple sightings reported by concerned citizens. She explained that several locals had observed not only unusual claw marks on trees, but also inexplicable disturbances in areas that were supposed to be undisturbed. "I've been tracking reports of injured wildlife that seem to be more than just accidents," Sarah confided. "So there's a pattern here, a deliberate infliction of harm that we can't ignore." Her detailed notes and photographs, when combined with Jack's own documentation, lent significant weight to the theory that Spirit's wounds were the result of targeted human cruelty. At the same time, the case began to attract the attention of a local journalist, Mark Rivera, known for his hard-hitting investigative pieces on environmental and social issues. Mark reached out to Jack, eager to corroborate the emerging narrative of deliberate abuse. Over several meetings in a small, cluttered cafe near the forest edge, Mark shared his findings, confidential tips from former employees of a local business owner with a notorious reputation, and financial records hinting at underhanded practices related to illegal wildlife trading. Mark's investigation suggested that the man behind these acts might be part of a larger network that exploited the wild for profit, casting a dark shadow over the pristine image the businessman had carefully cultivated. His revelations not only added urgency to Jack's quest, but also began to connect the dots between Spirit-specific injuries and a broader pattern of exploitation. As these subplots converged, Jack's personal reflections grew increasingly introspective. Each new piece of evidence, from Mr. Thompson's historical accounts to Sarah's meticulously gathered data, forced him to confront the brutal reality that human cruelty could leave scars as deep and deliberate as any injury inflicted by nature. In the solitude of his camp, beneath the whispering pines and the soft, persistent murmur of the forest at night, Jack began recording his thoughts in a weathered journal. He wrote about the paradox of a wilderness that, on one hand, was indifferent to suffering, yet on the other, could become a silent witness to unspeakable acts of cruelty. His entries captured the growing tension between his hardened instincts as a seasoned hiker and the compassionate drive that had led him to rescue Spirit in the first place. Local community meetings further deepened the narrative. At one such gathering held in the modest town hall, residents and activists debated passionately about the nature of wildlife neglect and the ethical responsibilities of those with power. Many shared heart-wrenching stories of abandoned animals and unsolved cases of cruelty, arguing that Spirit's case was merely the tip of the iceberg. "This is not just about one dog," an elderly woman insisted, her voice choked with emotion. "It's about a system that sees vulnerable creatures as expendable. We must demand accountability." Her impassioned words resonated with many in the room, sparking discussions that bridged the gap between personal tragedy and systemic injustice. Amidst the public debates, a quiet but persistent counter-narrative emerged from a group of local skeptics who argued that while the evidence of cruelty was disturbing, nature had its own ways of healing, and that not every injury could be attributed to deliberate human malice. "Animals adapt and overcome," one scientist remarked during a community forum. "We must be cautious in interpreting every mark as a sign of exploitation." This perspective, rooted in a strictly empirical understanding of animal behavior, clashed with the more emotive and holistic views that Jack and his supporters were beginning to espouse. In the midst of these competing narratives, Jack began collaborating more closely with Sarah and Mark. Together, they formed an informal coalition aimed at pooling their evidence and amplifying their findings. They organized small, discreet field trips into the forest to re-examine the sites where Spirit had been injured, using digital cameras and GPS trackers to document every new clue. Their collective work began to reveal a pattern, a trail that suggested the presence of a shadowy figure responsible for a series of deliberate injuries inflicted on local wildlife over the past few years. These excursions not only fortified their case, but also served to bond the group together, each member driven by the conviction that they had a moral duty to expose the truth. As the digital conversation around Spirit's case grew online, social media became a vibrant forum for people to share their own experiences and theories. Posts under hashtags like Marn Justice for Spirit and Marn Save Our Wild began to trend locally, uniting a diverse group of citizens, from students and activists to retired rangers and everyday nature lovers, around the call for accountability and change. This digital activism not only provided moral support to Jack, but also pressured local authorities to take a closer look at the emerging evidence. Thus, the subplots, ranging from historical accounts of deliberate cruelty, the meticulous documentation by wildlife advocates, the investigative reporting by local journalists, to the passionate debates in community forums, formed an intricate web that bound Jack's personal mission to a larger societal struggle. The convergence of these narratives underscored a chilling truth. The exploitation of the wild by human greed was a systemic problem, one that demanded not only local action, but a broader re-examination of how society valued the vulnerable. Each new piece of evidence, each shared story, added weight to the call for justice, transforming Spirit's personal tragedy into a beacon of collective resistance against cruelty. As the days passed following Jack's initial compassionate act, the investigation into Spirit's injury and the mysterious clues began to converge into a critical turning point. What had started as a personal rescue mission had now escalated into a community-wide confrontation, a clash between those demanding immediate justice for human cruelty and those advocating for a deeper, more methodical investigation into the dark forces at play. At first, Jack's discovery of the deliberate claw marks, the torn pendant and the precise footprints had raised questions that he could barely fathom. Every detail suggested that Spirit's suffering was not an unfortunate accident of nature, but rather the result of targeted human malice. These findings had stirred a mix of shock and indignation among local residents. In small gatherings at the town diner, people spoke in hushed, impassioned tones of similar injustices, tales of wildlife harmed by poachers, of animals used as collateral in human conflicts, and of the often unseen cruelty inflicted by those with power. The tension reached a palpable height during a specially convened community forum at the local town hall. The room, filled with local wildlife advocates, community leaders, and concerned citizens, buzzed with conflicting voices. One impassioned activist, tears welling in her eyes, declared, "If we allow such cruelty to go unchecked, we not only lose a noble creature like Spirit, but we also sacrifice our collective humanity." Her plea was met with equal fervor by others who recounted similar incidents from the past. Incidents that had long been swept under the rug by authorities unwilling to confront powerful interests. Yet, not everyone in the forum was ready to embrace a purely emotional response. A contingent of pragmatic officials argued that while the evidence of deliberate injury was disturbing, it was critical that any action taken be based on solid, empirical proof. "We must avoid letting our emotions override the facts," insisted one local council member. "A rush to judgment without comprehensive evidence could lead to unintended consequences." This insistence on a measured approach clashed with the growing public outcry, intensifying the division between those who demanded immediate retribution and those who called for a systematic investigation. Amid these heated debates, an anonymous tip arrived that further electrified the atmosphere. The tip, delivered as a cryptic email signed "Hope's Keeper," stated, "The pain inflicted on the innocent bears the mark of deliberate cruelty. Follow the trail where shadows lie, and the truth will be unveiled." Attached to the email was a blurry photograph showing Spirit near a secluded section of the forest, a location where recent disturbances had been reported by local animal welfare volunteers. This chilling message validated Jack's worst fears and added urgency to his quest for answers. Concurrently, local media picked up the story with increasing intensity. Sensational headlines began to circulate. "Injured wolf's cry for help exposes dark secrets," and Man's act of compassion unmasks human cruelty in the wild. Journalists interviewed wildlife experts, former employees of the implicated millionaire, and community members, each account adding layers of complexity to the narrative. The media coverage polarized public opinion even further, with passionate calls for accountability from some segments and skeptical caution from others. The scrutiny made it clear that Spirit's case had grown far beyond an isolated incident. It had become a symbol of broader systemic exploitation and neglect. Officer Ryan, who had initially assisted Jack in documenting the evidence, now emerged as a reluctant but determined ally in the fight for justice. His own transformation, from a by-the-book enforcer to someone deeply moved by the suffering of a vulnerable creature, added a personal dimension to the unfolding drama. In private conversations with Jack, Ryan admitted, "I never imagined I'd see the day when a wounded wolf would force me to question everything I thought I knew about this world. But every piece of evidence, every angry cry from the wild, tells me that we must act." His emotional testimony, filled with regret and resolve, resonated with those who felt that the cruelty inflicted upon Spirit was part of a larger, festering wound within the community. The convergence of these diverse narratives, the impassioned community outcry, the rigorously documented evidence, the anonymous messages, and the media's relentless spotlight created a pressure cooker of conflicting emotions and high stakes. The question that now loomed large was not merely about punishing an individual, but about exposing a network of neglect and exploitation that had allowed such cruelty to fester. The collective call for justice was growing louder, yet there remained a voice of caution, urging that the investigation be thorough and measured to ensure that no false accusations marred the pursuit of truth. In a final, decisive moment at the community forum, as voices clashed and the room trembled with raw emotion, the assembled group faced a choice: to demand immediate punitive action against those responsible, or to invest in a comprehensive, independent investigation that could uncover the full extent of the systemic abuse. This choice was more than administrative. It was a moral crossroads that would determine the community's future approach to justice, compassion, and the stewardship of nature. In that charged atmosphere, as dark clouds gathered and the first drops of rain began to fall outside, Jack felt the weight of responsibility settle upon him. He knew that the next steps would not only shape the destiny of Spirit, but could also redefine the community's moral compass. The conflict between raw emotion and cold, measured investigation had reached its zenith, setting the stage for a final, decisive confrontation that would expose the dark underbelly of human cruelty and, hopefully, pave the way for healing. In the charged atmosphere of the community forum and amidst the mounting evidence, the moment for final confrontation had arrived. The debate had raged for weeks. Impassioned calls for immediate retribution clashed with appeals for measured, systematic inquiry. Now the community stood on the brink of decisive action, with every heart heavy with the burden of truth and every mind fixated on the fate of Spirit. On a stormy evening, with rain lashing the windows of the town hall, Jack gathered with the small task force comprising local wildlife experts, community activists, and sympathetic officials at the very clearing where the earlier evidence had been gathered. Under the ancient oak that had silently witnessed so many secrets, the group arranged themselves in a circle. The air was thick with anticipation as Jack unfolded a meticulously prepared report, compiled from his own field notes, photographs of the deliberate claw marks, and the torn pendant that had been discovered near the scene. His voice, steady but laden with raw emotion, filled the clearing. "Every piece of evidence points to a deliberate act of cruelty," Jack declared, his eyes scanning the faces of those gathered. "Spirit's injury wasn't a random accident of nature. It was inflicted with intent. And we cannot, in good conscience, let this injustice continue." His words resonated powerfully among the group, drawing nods and murmurs of agreement. A local wildlife investigator, Peter, stepped forward to detail his analysis. He explained how the precision of the marks and the methodical pattern in which they were inflicted were unlike any natural encounter. "These marks," he stated, "suggest the use of a tool, a calculated, targeted act." This wasn't the chaotic result of a predator's attack. It was something far more sinister. His technical explanation lent credence to the notion that human malice was at work, transforming the issue from a matter of animal survival into one of moral and systemic failure. Amid the technical discussions, a representative from the local animal welfare organization, Sarah, recounted the emotional testimonies of other volunteers and local residents. She spoke passionately about the ripple effects of spirit suffering. Every report we've received, every eyewitness account, points to a broader pattern of neglect and deliberate abuse, she said, her voice cracking with emotion. We owe it to spirit, and to all the vulnerable creatures in our community, to expose this darkness and ensure that justice is served. At that moment, the tension in the clearing reached its zenith. An anonymous envelope, delivered earlier that day, was opened by Jack. Inside, detailed documents, including internal memos and photographs, uncovered a disturbing history of similar incidents tied to a notorious local businessman known for his philanthropic facade. The evidence was damning. It painted a picture of systematic exploitation, where animals and even employees were treated as disposable. The revelation sent a shockwave through the group, silencing even the most cautious voices. The room fell into a heavy, reflective hush as the true scope of the injustice became undeniably clear. Officer Ryan, who had evolved from a detached enforcer to a compassionate advocate, stepped forward with a calm determination. We stand here not just to condemn a single act, but to challenge a system that allows such cruelty to flourish under the guise of wealth and influence, he said, his voice resonating with both authority and empathy. We must demand accountability and reform, not only for spirit, but for every life that has been overlooked and exploited. His words bridged the gap between the technical evidence and the emotional urgency of the community, and they sparked a renewed sense of purpose among those present. The final confrontation was now a matter of decision. The assembled task force debated the next steps. Some argued for immediate legal action against the businessman, while others called for a broader, independent investigation to document the full extent of the systemic abuse. After long, impassioned discussions, a consensus emerged. The community would initiate a dual-pronged approach. A formal complaint would be filed, backed by the overwhelming evidence, while an independent investigation, led by a coalition of local activists, wildlife experts, and investigative journalists, would ensure that the deeper, underlying issues were fully exposed. In that climactic moment, as dark clouds loomed overhead and the first drops of rain began to fall, Jack, Ryan, and their allies made a solemn vow. They pledged that no act of cruelty would be swept under the rug, and that the call for justice echoed by spirit suffering would not be silenced. The task force would work tirelessly to dismantle the network of exploitation, to hold the perpetrators accountable, and to restore the balance of compassion in the community. As the meeting drew to a close and the group dispersed into the rain-soaked night, a palpable sense of resolve hung in the air. The fight for justice had only just begun, but the collective determination of the community promised a future where vulnerability was protected and cruelty was confronted head-on. That night, as the rain fell in relentless sheets and the wind whipped through the dark forest, every heartbeat in the community seemed to echo with the weight of the unresolved crisis. The evidence of deliberate cruelty, painstakingly gathered by Jack and his team, had ignited a firestorm of anger, sorrow, and determination that now reached its critical point. The once isolated case of Spirit, the wounded wolf, had grown into a symbol of systemic neglect and exploitation that demanded justice from all corners of the community. Under a sky churned by tumultuous clouds, Jack and Officer Ryan and their allies gathered at the edge of the forest, near the very clearing where all the evidence had first converged. The atmosphere was electric, heavy with the anticipation of what was to come. Every detail, from the precise claw marks on the soft soil to the torn, delicate pendant found nearby, had been meticulously documented. These clues, combined with the damning internal memos leaked by a former employee and the anonymous tips circulating through local networks, formed an unassailable case of human cruelty that had inflicted deep wounds on Spirit. As the assembled group stood in the damp clearing, the roar of the storm outside served as a grim counterpoint to the fervent determination inside. The community had long been divided between those who demanded immediate retribution against the millionaire responsible, and those who insisted on a methodical, comprehensive investigation into the network of neglect and exploitation. Now faced with the raw, indisputable evidence laid out before them, the divisions seemed to narrow into a single, powerful resolve to expose and eradicate the cruelty that had been hidden beneath a veneer of wealth and public philanthropy. Jack stepped forward, his voice steady but resonant with urgency. "We are standing at the very edge of darkness," he declared, "and the only way forward is to shine a light on every hidden injustice. Spirit suffering is not an isolated incident. It is a cry for help that echoes across our entire community. We cannot ignore this any longer." His words, weighted with both personal loss and collective outrage, reverberated through the group, stirring even the most cautious among them. In that charged moment, Officer Ryan Few, who had transformed from a detached enforcer to a passionate advocate for the vulnerable, took a deep breath and added, "We must act now. The evidence we have gathered is overwhelming, and every minute we delay only allows this cycle of cruelty to continue. It's not just about holding one man accountable, it's about dismantling a system that treats life as disposable." His declaration cut through the murmur of dissent and fear, galvanizing the team to take the next step. The tension in the clearing was palpable. Rain hammered on the leaves overhead, as if nature itself was bearing witness to the proceedings. Every eye in the group was fixed on the documents spread across a weathered wooden crate, every heart pounding with the knowledge that this moment would define their future. The community's task force, now a coalition of wildlife experts, investigative journalists, local activists, and former insiders, prepared to move forward with a coordinated operation. Their plan was both bold and multifaceted: launch a full-scale independent investigation to document the millionaire's history of exploitation, while simultaneously filing formal legal complaints to force accountability. As the group debated the final details, an unexpected gust of wind sent a chill down everyone's spine. A symbolic reminder, perhaps, that the forces of nature and justice were inextricably linked. In that moment, a senior member of the task force, a respected local lawyer named Mr. Ellis, spoke up. "This is our turning point," he said, his voice firm and resolute. "We have the evidence, we have the support of the community, and we have a duty to protect not only the wildlife, but every vulnerable soul affected by this cruelty. We stand united, and together we will see that justice is served." With Mr. Ellis's impassioned call resonating in the air, the group reached a critical consensus. They agreed to set a specific timeline for the independent investigation, to gather further testimonies from those who had been directly affected, and to mobilize legal support to ensure that the truth would not be buried beneath the weight of corporate power. The decision was met with a mix of relief and solemn determination, a collective acknowledgement that the battle against cruelty had just begun, but that they were now ready to face it head-on. As the meeting drew to a close, the storm outside began to subside, and a fragile, tentative calm replaced the earlier clamor. The task force members dispersed, each carrying with them the burden of responsibility and the hope of a community united against injustice. Jack lingered at the clearing a little longer, gazing at the rain-soaked earth that bore the marks of cruelty and resistance. In that silent, reflective moment, he felt the immense weight of the journey, a journey that had taken him from a solitary act of kindness to the forefront of a fight for justice that would determine the fate of an entire community. The peak tension of that night had set the stage for the final act, a decisive confrontation with the forces of exploitation, a moment when the hidden truths would finally be brought into the light. The call for justice, echoing in every raindrop and every breath of the forest, promised that no cruelty would go unanswered. That night, as a heavy, turbulent storm battered the forest and darkness cloaked every shadow, everything converged into one electrifying, heart-pounding moment, a moment when the truth would finally burst forth. Jack, driven by a fierce determination and the raw emotions of his journey with Spirit, led his small task force deep into the forest where all the evidence had pointed. The wind howled and rain lashed at them as they reached the site, a secluded clearing beneath an ancient, towering oak that seemed to pulse with silent authority. Under the relentless downpour, The clearing was illuminated only by the occasional flash of lightning. The ancient oak, its bark etched with mysterious, weathered symbols, stood as a sentinel to decades of secrets. At the center of the clearing lay fresh, deliberate claw marks etched into the soft earth, alongside scattered remnants of torn fabric and a discarded piece of a necklace, evidence that had been previously gathered and now displayed before the gathered group. Jack's heart pounded as he scanned the scene, each detail reinforcing the chilling possibility that Spirit suffering had been no accident but a calculated act of cruelty. In that fraught silence, Officer Ryan stepped forward, his voice steady yet charged with emotion. "We've followed every clue," he said, his gaze sweeping over the determined faces of wildlife experts, community activists, and local law enforcement gathered there. Every mark, every torn piece, every footprint, all point to one undeniable truth: someone deliberately hurt Spirit. His words reverberated through the clearing, the storm's roar providing a somber counterpoint to his impassioned declaration. At that moment, a flash of lightning illuminated the forest, and in its brief glow, Jack noticed a figure emerging from the shadows at the edge of the clearing. The mysterious individual, clad in dark, weather-beaten clothing, moved silently toward the group. A palpable tension gripped everyone as the figure came into clearer view. A person whose presence confirmed the worst of Jack's suspicions. With deliberate, measured steps, the stranger approached and halted a few paces away, hands empty, but eyes filled with a defiant resolve. The stranger's presence, combined with the overwhelming physical evidence, forced the gathered group into a final confrontation. The tension was so thick that even the ceaseless patter of rain seemed to fade into the background. Jack, stepping forward with a mix of courage and raw determination, demanded, "Who are you? What do you have to say for the cruelty inflicted on Spirit?" The question hung in the air, heavy with accusation. For a long, agonizing moment, the stranger said nothing. Then, with a voice that was low and laden with regret, the figure finally spoke. I never meant for it to come to this," the stranger admitted, the words trembling on his lips. "I was part of something much larger, something I believed would help, but it went horribly wrong." The confession sent shockwaves through the group. The revelation that the deliberate harm to Spirit was not a random act, but part of a calculated, systemic abuse by individuals operating in the shadows, confirmed the worst of what Jack and his team had feared. As the stranger continued, he revealed that he had been involved with a clandestine operation sponsored by a powerful, wealthy figure whose public persona of philanthropy masked a ruthless, exploitative agenda. "We were told it was for the greater good," the stranger confessed, his eyes brimming with remorse. "But in reality, we were simply pawns in a game of profit and power. When I realized the extent of the cruelty we were inflicting on innocent creatures, I couldn't bear it anymore. I tried to warn them. I tried to stop it." His words spilled out in a torrent of regret and anguish, each sentence a bitter acknowledgement of a broken system. In that climactic moment, the full magnitude of the injustice crashed over everyone like a tidal wave. The wounded Spirit, who had once approached Jack in silent desperation, now lay nearby, a living testament to the cruelty of human greed. The stranger's confession, laced with vulnerability and remorse, confirmed that Spirit's injury was a deliberate act designed to exploit the wild for profit, to send a message of dominance by those who believed they were above nature. Officer Ryan's eyes filled with tears as he absorbed the truth. The transformation in his own heart, from detachment to a fierce, protective empathy, found its ultimate purpose in this moment. "We will not let this continue," Ryan vowed, his voice echoing with conviction over the storm's din. "Not only for Spirit, but for every living being left to suffer in silence." His declaration was a rallying cry, a call to dismantle the network of exploitation that had brought such deliberate cruelty to the wilderness. With the stranger now in custody, the task force quickly secured all the evidence, and Jack led a team to document every detail of the clearing, photographing the claw marks, collecting remnants of torn fabric, and carefully recording the symbols on the ancient oak. The evidence, now overwhelming, formed the cornerstone of a new, resolute campaign for justice. In that final, breathtaking climax, as the storm began to subside and the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, the community's collective resolve solidified. The confrontation had exposed not only the deep-seated cruelty that had wounded Spirit, but had also ignited a promise of retribution and systemic change. Jack, Officer Ryan, and their allies, with the solemn testimony of the remorseful stranger echoing in their ears, vowed to see that those responsible would be held accountable. The battle for justice was about to begin in earnest, a battle that would bring the hidden networks of exploitation into the unforgiving light of truth. As the first light of dawn broke over the misty forest, a fragile calm settled in the wake of the stormy night's revelations. The journey that began with an injured wolf's desperate plea for help had transformed into a powerful saga of resilience, accountability, and the unyielding strength of compassion. For Jack and Officer Ryan, what started as a solitary act of rescue evolved into a crusade against a deep-seated network of human cruelty, a network that had inflicted unspeakable suffering on Spirit, the wounded wolf who had come to symbolize the vulnerable in nature. In the quiet aftermath of the dramatic confrontation in the secluded clearing, the evidence against those responsible for Spirit's injuries lay undeniable. The deliberate claw marks, the torn pendant, and the precise footprints had all coalesced into a damning testament to exploitation and neglect. The remorseful confession of the shadowy figure, once part of a system driven by greed and power, had shaken the community to its core, exposing a hidden underbelly of human malice that had long lurked behind the polished facade of wealth and philanthropy. For the community, Spirit's case became a rallying cry, a symbol of hope that even the most wounded souls could be healed through acts of genuine kindness and collective action. At town hall meetings, impassioned speeches gave voice to both outrage and the desire for deep systemic change. Local animal welfare groups, emboldened by the evidence and the stirring public debate, began pushing for reforms to ensure that no creature would ever again be treated as disposable. The once divided community slowly united under the common banner of compassion, determined to challenge the indifference that had allowed cruelty to flourish unchecked. Officer Ryan's transformation, from a detached enforcer of the law to a steadfast guardian of the vulnerable, had not only redefined his own path, but had also inspired those around him. His heartfelt declaration, echoing through the storm-soaked clearing, was more than a promise to Spirit. It was a pledge to uphold justice for every living being silenced by neglect. In his eyes, the case of Spirit had become emblematic of a broader moral imperative, to dismantle systems that devalue life and to reaffirm that true strength lies in the capacity to care for others, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant. Jack Ewis, whose compassion had sparked this entire movement, now carried the weight of responsibility with quiet dignity. His careful documentation of every detail, from the deliberate claw marks to the torn fabric of the pendant, had laid the groundwork for an investigation that promised to expose the full extent of the exploitation at hand. Every step he had taken in the forest, every sleepless night spent retracing clues, had led him to this moment of reckoning. The once isolated act of helping a wounded wolf had grown into a multifaceted campaign for justice, one that would hold the perpetrators accountable and restore hope in a community long scarred by indifference. In the weeks that followed, a task force was established, a coalition of wildlife experts, investigative journalists, community activists, and compassionate law enforcement officials. Their mandate was clear: to ensure that the dark networks of cruelty and exploitation were brought into the light and that Spirit's suffering would never again be ignored. The task force worked tirelessly, gathering further evidence, interviewing witnesses, and collaborating with local authorities to launch a comprehensive investigation. Their efforts served as a beacon, a reminder that when people come together, even the deepest wounds can begin to heal. As the investigation gained momentum, local media shifted their narrative from sensationalism to a nuanced exploration of the transformative power of empathy. Editorials and feature stories celebrated not just the heroism of those who had rescued Spirit, but also the resilience of a creature who, despite its injuries, embodied the enduring will to survive. The collective outcry for justice became a movement that transcended individual cases and sparked broader discussions about the ethical responsibilities of those in positions of power. Now, as the community stands at the threshold of a promising future, the legacy of Spirit, the wounded wolf whose silent plea for help ignited a wave of change, remains a powerful testament to the strength of compassion. The journey of healing is ongoing, and the task force's investigation serves as a constant reminder that no act of cruelty can ever truly go unchallenged when people are united by empathy. Thank you for joining us on this deeply moving journey of transformation, justice, and hope. If Spirit's story and the inspiring actions of those who fought to heal his wounds have touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, like this video, and share your thoughts in the comments below. We invite you to reflect on the power of compassion, to change lives, and to help ensure that every voice, human or animal, is heard. Stay tuned for more stories that explore the profound connections between humanity and the natural world, and let's continue to champion kindness and accountability together.